A tactical masterclass, a constitutional crisis, and, well, a strategic nightmare. Today, we're going to break down the incredibly complex, far-reaching consequences of a hypothetical U.S. military strike on Venezuela. This is all based on a really detailed strategic analysis, so let's just dive right in.
So our story kicks off on a single date, in a single city, January 3rd, 2026. In the early morning hours, under the cover of darkness, the entire geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere is about to get redrawn, and violently so.
The mission was called Operation Absolute Resolve, and honestly, it was swift, it was targeted, and it was incredibly decisive. The official line wasn't regime change. No. It was law enforcement, basically to execute a years-old arrest warrant. And the result? A stunning success. They got their targets alive, and no American casualties were reported. But this is where the simple part of the story ends.
Okay, so first, let's look at the operation itself. From a purely military perspective, it was a textbook example of modern American power. I mean, a true tactical masterpiece. But as we're about to see, that masterpiece is exactly what laid the groundwork for absolute strategic chaos.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how this was just a symphony of overwhelming force. You had F-22s and F-35s that just erased Venezuela's Russian-made air defenses. Then, EA-18 Growlers swooped in to jam the entire grid, plunging Caracas into total darkness. And then, you get the legendary 160th SOAR flying Delta Force operators in at treetop level to actually make the capture. The whole thing was coordinated from a command ship sitting offshore. It was just a flawless, almost sci-fi display of technological dominance.
But all that technological precision, it came at a pretty brutal human cost. Reports from the ground paint a much grimmer picture of a really fierce firefight. We're talking at least 80 people killed, and that includes a big chunk of Maduro's core security team, many of whom were actually Cuban personnel. So yeah, this wasn't some clean, quiet arrest. It was a bloody battle.
And that bloody battle, it immediately leads to the next big problem. Taking out the head of state didn't actually decapitate the regime. It just created this terrifying power vacuum. And this brings us to a famous, if unofficial, rule of geopolitics.
The Pottery Barn Rule. You've probably heard this before. It was famously stated by Colin Powell. You break it, you own it. By grabbing Maduro, the U.S. didn't solve a problem. It inherited a nation of 30 million people that was already on the brink of collapse. They now owned the whole crisis.
So here's the absolute heart of the problem. The complete mismatch between the American plan and the reality on the ground. The idea was that the U.S. would kind of run Venezuela through a hand-picked transition team. But the Venezuelan military, they didn't just roll over. Instead, they closed ranks, called the strike a cowardly kidnapping, and swore allegiance to Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Just like that, they installed her as the new head of state. And bam! An instant constitutional crisis was born.
Now let's jump to the next ripple effect, because these shockwaves didn't just stay in Caracas. Oh no. They slammed into Washington, D.C. with the force of a political earthquake, and they kicked off this bitter civil war over the very nature of presidential power itself.
The administration's defense was, well, it was a piece of serious legal gymnastics. Secretary of State Marco Rubio argued this wasn't an act of war at all, but a law enforcement action to serve a warrant. The charge was narco-terrorism. This whole framing was a very deliberate, very clever attempt to completely bypass Congress's constitutional power to declare war.
But you can imagine, legal experts immediately called foul. As Columbia law professor Matthew Waxman put it, listen, when you're using B-1B bombers and F-22s against another country's capital, you can call it whatever you want. It's an act of war, plain and simple.
You know, for the interventionist hawks inside the MAGA movement, this whole constitutional debate was basically irrelevant. Vice President J.D. Vance's reported comment was just shockingly blunt, just dismissing any concerns about international law. For this group, this was a triumphant show of American strength. The legal details, who cares?
But, and this is a huge but, this created a massive fracture. The other side of the movement, the isolationist wing, represented by folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they felt totally betrayed. I mean, they thought they had voted to end endless wars, not to kick off new ones with unilateral strikes. This quote just perfectly captures that deep feeling of disillusionment and anger, splitting the president's own base right down the middle.
So, while America is basically at war with itself over this, the rest of the world is watching. And they're in this mixture of shock and anger. The strike basically announced the birth of a new, really aggressive American foreign policy.
And commentators pretty quickly gave it a name, the Donroe Doctrine. Think of it like a supercharged 21st century version of the old Monroe Doctrine. The message was unmistakable. The Western Hemisphere is America's backyard, period. And any rivals, like China and Russia, will be kicked out, by force if necessary. International law is a secondary concern.
The global reaction was all over the place. China, for its part, saw a strategic trap, so they didn't get involved militarily. Instead, they used the whole thing as a massive diplomatic weapon to just hammer the US on hypocrisy. Russia was publicly humiliated because its prized air defense systems were completely useless. And crucially, powers in Latin America, even allies like Brazil, all united to condemn it because they were terrified of who might be next. For a lot of countries in the global south, this was the final straw, the thing that pushed them to look for alternatives to a US-led world.
Which brings us to the final, and maybe the most important piece of this whole puzzle, the money. You see, the entire operation was sold to the public on a very simple promise. This war was going to pay for itself.
The idea was pretty straightforward. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on Earth, so the thinking went, we can just seize that oil, sell it, and pay the US back for the cost of the intervention. A neat, tidy, self-funding operation. But the question is, was that ever actually realistic?
The short answer? Nope, not even close. Here's the key number you need to know. After years and years of total mismanagement and sanctions, Venezuela's oil industry was pumping out less than 1% of the world's daily supply. It was a nobody, which is why the global oil markets barely even blinked after the strike.
And getting that oil flowing again? It's a gigantic task. Just look at the brutal reality here. Experts figure it would take up to 3 years and maybe $30 billion just to get production stable. A real, meaningful expansion, you're looking at over a decade and well over $100 billion. This isn't like flipping a switch. It's like trying to rebuild an industry that is literally rotted from the ground up.
And here it is. Here's the legal checkmate. Without a stable, legitimate Venezuelan government inviting you in, international law has a very specific word for an occupying power that takes and sells a country's resources: pillage. It's a war crime. Any company that tried to sell that oil would have its assets seized in ports all over the world.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways from all this. A militarily perfect operation created a complete strategic disaster. The Pottery Barn Rule is now in full, terrifying effect. The strike shattered a key political coalition at home and alienated allies abroad. And that whole idea that Venezuela's oil would pay for everything, yeah, that was frankly a fantasy. And all of that leaves us with one final, very sobering question. The mission succeeded. It removed one man, a dictator. But in doing that, did it actually eliminate a threat to the United States? Or did it just shatter a nation, creating a failed state right on America's doorstep that's now going to demand blood, treasure, and attention for decades to come? That is the billion-dollar question that this whole operation leaves behind.